Hello, welcome to Circle Time, the Early Years podcast with me, Glenn Denny. I'm delighted, in fact, honoured, to have the Chief Executive of the Early Years Alliance, Neil Leitch, with me. Neil, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here as well.
It's brilliant to have you. Now, Neil, I mean, we see your face quite often. You're not one of these kind of chief executives that prepared to just sit in an office and just let everyone else do the work. You are that, and I mean this in the best possible sense of the word, you are very vocal for your passion and enthusiasm and everything about early years, particularly right now. I mean, I think your voice and all the other voices that are screaming and shouting out there are really needed right now, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a really tough position. I've described it on many interviews, Glenn, as being in a critical position. I've been around the sector for about 20 years. I mean, my background was finance. I used to chair the Finance Industry Standards Association, so a far cry from what I'm doing now. But I sort of came into the sector. I've seen change after change after change. And so when I say that I think that we're in crisis, I genuinely mean that. I've never witnessed anything quite as tough in terms of a time period as we're in at this particular point. So yeah, I've seen some changes, that's for sure.
I mean, they certainly have. I mean, I've been in it as a practitioner and now a manager for the last 26 years. And I've gone through many changes as well, like we say, for the whole sector. But it does seem tougher now. Do you think COVID has had an impact on that, or do you think it was bubbling away before that?
Yeah, I think it's been brewing for some time. I mean, I used the term the other day, I think, when I was giving evidence to the Education Select Committee that we've been neglected. And I think it has been literally for a couple of decades and gradually got worse and worse. But I do think that the pandemic basically highlighted certainly some of the major issues that we've had within the sector. And I think also it made many people realize that they were undervalued. I mean, it's quite interesting that, in the early days when we first had lockdown, we obviously, many settings stayed open for essential workers. The clinical evidence, I would say at that particular point in time, was pretty vague, to say the least.
Yeah.
And you'd have some of our educators going home in the evening and they'd be turning on the TV and they would see that 1,000 people, for example, had died in the last 24 hours. And so while most people were, to a degree, closeted, protected, I think, from COVID, and rightly so, I have to say these people were going home and they were risking in their terms their well-being, their health. And for very, very little thanks, dare I say, we would all go out on Thursday night, if I recall, and we would clap the NHS, and rightly so again, I would suggest. But people working with the children of essential workers without protection, without, PPE, and you'll know this, Glenn, you can't have a situation when you're dealing with a little 2-year-old that's fretting or fallen over or whatever it happens to be. You can't be masked up, etc. So they were exposed to all of these particular problems. And as I say, I think it just highlighted how neglectful, dare I say, government was at the time in terms of caring for them. I mean, it was only literally a few weeks before home tests became available to the public that the early years sector got them.
No, I remember
schools,
that.
You'll remember it. Schools had them all the way through, despite the fact that primary schools were closed, and yet early year settings were open. So I think what happened during that period, to come back to your point, was that people realized that they were undervalued. I don't think parents undervalued them. In fact, the one positive thing I would say that came from the pandemic is that parents realized that, you need support, you need help, and early years settings, whether that be childminders, preschools, or nurseries, were doing that for parents. So I think all of a sudden parents started to value even more the work that people in the early years do. It just happened to be, dare I say, policy formers tended to ignore the early years sector. And so when we got to a sort of rare statistic whereby you literally had more vacancies than you had unemployed, and people had gone through a pretty tough patch emotionally, physically, felt that they were undervalued, underpaid, you name it. You've used up a lot of goodwill. And then we hit a financial crisis. So you have a position whereby people are struggling to pay the bills, then a pretty tough job, which is really not valued by government. We shouldn't be surprised if people basically are quitting the sector. And that's just one part of the chaos, I'd suggest, and the crisis that we're in at this particular point in time.
It's definitely one, but one that has a knock-on effect. I mean, certainly one setting that I've worked in not that long ago, for those that kind of follow the podcast, I have recently changed jobs, but one setting we were struggling and struggling and struggling to recruit. I mean, struggling just not a strong enough word. You know, the management team were on their knees trying to get people to come in and work, and it wasn't as though they weren't paying them decent enough wage. It was good pay, but we just couldn't get. Do you think it's a case of that people are just frightened to come into this sector anymore because of not necessarily bad press, but just there's a reputation out there that the early years is so underfunded that people are just afraid to come in and join it?
Yeah, I come back to the point that the biggest reason, we did a survey back in December of 21. I think we launched the results. And it was a pretty substantial survey, so it was significant. And when you ask people why they were leaving the sector, it was interesting that actually salaries were third down the list. So when you refer to salaries being, trying to pay a reasonable amount, that actually was third down the list in terms of poor pay. As I recall it, actually, the highest factor, around nearly 80%, was being undervalued by government. Then just under that, around 72%, I think the figure was stress, extreme job-related stress. Then it was poor pay, around 60%. And then the other two were, I think it was impact on staff shortages, which, then everybody else is having to work longer hours, having to deal with more, I suppose, aspects of the early years. And as I say, we shouldn't be surprised that it took its toll, and the sad thing is you had people that had been in the sector for literally decades. I mean, I remember talking to somebody who'd been doing in the early years sector for something like 35 years, loved it, had been all of her life, but just had enough at that particular point in time. And at the moment, it's quite interesting. We're seeing lots of mergers and acquisitions, and I'm sure for some organizations that's really great. But actually, the downside of that is there's a lot of early year settings that have just had enough. And part of that is impacted by the people, of course, that used to work in those settings that are coming out.
I know. I mean, going back to some of my own experience there, I mean, you talk about settings going under. I mean, we were quite fortunate in our setting that it was a new setting. It's been open just over 2 years, and it started right in the middle of 2020. I mean, great time to open a nursery, but it worked. But one of our nearby neighbours who'd been around for years, all of a sudden, just closed.
Yeah.
And it was the underfunding again. It goes back to one of your earlier points that we're just that poor relation that nobody really wants to talk to in government.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, the one thing I think about the Alliance, which helps our position, is the fact that we are, as you may be aware, but we are the largest membership organisation in England. But beyond that, we are also an operator of early years provision in our own right. So we operate at the moment around 60 settings. The difference between us and why we're not criticised for that is because we operate in areas of deprivation where, dare I say, if all you were concerned with was a business model no one would operate there full stop. Okay. So if it breaks even for us, it's about as good as it gets. But this time, 3.5, 4 years ago, we operated 132 settings. So I like to think then when we talk about the challenges of the early years, we do it with first-hand experience. And again, many of these settings have been around for some time in communities that needed support, but they closed and they've gone by the wayside. And that is because you said sort of feels like a poor relation. Yeah, I do. I think it is interesting when just about every policy that comes out of government, every acknowledgement that comes out of government about education seems to think that it doesn't start until a child hits the age of 5 and walks, or 4 and walks through the primary school gates. And yet, many of my close friends are in primary school, secondary school education. Some of the people I work with quite closely, and again, good friends in this sector, union leaders of schools, unions, etc. They value the importance of early years because, of course, they see some of the difficulties of having children who have, social and emotional developments, etc., delays coming through to them. So they're not critical of the fact that early years should be treated as part of the education system. But dare I say, our policy formers don't see that. They see the early years as predominantly, dare I say, a mechanism to get mums back into work. And they don't see it beyond that. And yet, I mean, Glenn, you do this, you've done this for many, many years. Nobody would have to convince you of the critical importance of shaping life chances of young children. I mean, they're not commodities. That's the trouble. We have started to make early years, in terms of policy, nothing more than businesses. And of course, some operators have to operate as a business. Otherwise, you couldn't support these children. But it should fundamentally be about, socially developing children, making them good people, happy people, not all go-getters and everything is commercialized. And as I say, children become commodities. We've sort of lost track of what early years should be about. And we haven't, working in the sector. But over the last couple of decades, I'm afraid it's got worse in terms of policy formers and, dare I say, ministers, etc. We've had something like 22 early years ministers and secretaries of state in the last 10 years. If I was working for a large corporation, that would ring alarm bells in terms of continuity, leadership. It would be, what sort of organization is this that it has no sort of, as I say, continuity, full stop. And everyone that comes in bolts their little bit onto the early years system. We shouldn't be surprised that it's a bit of a mess.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is like, if there's no stability in the sector on the ground level, if there's no stability in the government department that's supposed to be making the policies. But there's that bit as well, kind of going back to a previous point you made, that the early years is crucial. And yes, it's about letting the children be children, but also early years is crucial for pinpointing developmental delays or language delays. We are critical for doing that for children, for giving them the best start that they can through life. And yet that's not acknowledged again. And it's infuriating. It's almost like, why should we bother? Well, we bother because of the children.
We bother because dare I say, people like you and others can't help themselves in a way. And, I would never criticize that. You sort of said right at the beginning, I think, that, I'm fairly vocal. I cannot help it. I cannot help it. I came from a single parent family. My father was an alcoholic. He was a wife abuser. I spent some time in care homes with my five other siblings, etc. I left school when I was 14. I fortunately had people that gave me life chances. But I also know some of my siblings, frankly, or three of my siblings have died, and they've died of drug and alcohol abuse, which they, was probably, dare I say, a product of the environment in which they grew up, because they were all older than me and my father, etc., etc. Now, the point is, we have the ability to change that and shape it. And that's why I think it is so unjust that we know they are the most influential years, and yet we're just treated as glorified babysitters and not much more than that. And that is beyond the rhetoric. There's no action that says that anyone really believes it's much more than that. And that's why I can't help myself, because I think it is just such an awful injustice for children.
Like, I mean, there's that bit as well, like going back to kind of when we were talking about the pandemic there as well. There was almost that glimmer of hope that we were called key workers, and it's like, finally, are they starting to realize our value? But almost as quickly as we were kind of boosted by that, that rug was pulled right from under us. It's like, now you just look after the children, on you go, off you go. But there was that bit as well, like you were talking about testing and things like that. And like, well, I even emailed my own MP at the time saying, well, how come schools are getting tests and all this, and yet early years aren't? And like you say, it was ages down the line before we were told, yes, go and get testing.
I remember doing an interview on LBC, and at the time, Priti Patel was in office, and she was assuring everybody that nurseries were safe environments, and that there wasn't a problem. But so we didn't need testing, and we didn't need support, was the implication all the way down the line. And I remember it was Nick. I think it was Nick Ferrari asking me the question. So what do you think of that, Neil? And I sort of couldn't help myself. I said, with all due respect, I would rather listen to a clinical advisor than somebody that told me 2 days ago it wasn't safe to go to a primary school, but is now telling me it's absolutely safe for our people to work in early year settings. And that, again, just summed up the way in which we were treated. It was lip service and not much more. I can recall, again, during the lockdown period, receiving an email at about 6 o'clock in the evening when, if you recall, Glenn, we had the first wave of the catch-up program, and Kevin Collins was the czar at the particular time. And I got an email. It was an embargoed email that basically said, this is the amount of money that's being released. It's for all children of all ages. It included the early years, specifically said that. And it had two thank you messages, one from the Secretary of State for Education, which was Gavin Williams at the time, and one from the Prime Minister, who was Boris Johnson at the time as well. That was around 6 o'clock. 1 hour and 8 minutes later, I'll never forget it. I'm sorry to be so pedantic, but it's 1 hour and 8 minutes later, I received another email that said, destroy the first one, basically, and apologize, because on this email removed early years entirely. Removed it entirely from the catch-up program. And that sort of speaks volumes. And it was interesting that shortly after that, Kevin Collins did resign, arguing there wasn't enough money in the system But given you're shaping the lives of children, why would you not invest in the early years? I mean, it seems so idiotic that to not put children on the right path. And again, I'm not talking about maths and, reading and writing. I'm talking about happy, healthy children that have a fundamental social core, which gives them the ability to learn anything they want to learn. Because without that, then we're just creating robots. And, and again, that's because everything we see as young children is focused on them being a mechanism to earn money for this country or to be revenue generators, rather than happy, kind people that might care for our planet, that might not abuse other children or other adults when they grow up. They might indirectly, yes, contribute a fortune to the economy. They might save us a fortune on health and crime, but it shouldn't be the motive. The motive should be to create nice, good people, So I feel like I'm lecturing somebody who knows all the answers in real terms and has experienced it all firsthand, but it sort of explains maybe why I can't sit still on this sometimes.
Well, we need people like you to not sit still because, you know, there's that bit where I think, with all due respect, you get to that kind of point, that sort of position of, dare I say, power, being like at the top of early years alliance, fantastic. Whereas us on the ground, we can shout all we like, but actually our voices aren't heard. But collectively, they're collected up by you, and you are just our loudspeaker to get that message out there that we're not happy, we're underfunded, we're overworked, we're just put upon. But why aren't we recognized as being as crucially important to young children's lives? It's infuriating.
No, I couldn't agree more. And it, I mean, you probably saw the recent article in the Guardian, which is talking about, extending the free sort of entitlement hours to 1 and 2 year olds, which came up over the weekend. Well, it just speak volumes because there wasn't a reference in that to be, propping up the sector, trying to get the sector back to where it should be, paying people, recognizing this is a profession. It's one of the most important jobs that anybody can do.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, what was it predominantly? A proposal to try and win across, dare I say, votes before the next election, because it talked a lot about Labour have said they'll do this, so and so. You shouldn't need somebody else to move you to. And we had it at the last sort of, well, dare I say, when the government first came into power, I can recall having several phone calls saying, Neil, we're going to up the number of free hours, but we will pay you more. We will do this, etc., etc. That's got nothing to do with creating educated, good, well-balanced children. That's about winning votes so you can stay in power. And I'm trying not to be political, but whether we like it or not, the early years has been a political football between parties.
Yeah.
Just a few weeks usually before the elections. And, I probably couldn't use half the words that I would like to use to explain my real emotions.
I have said I haven't needed to edit podcasts. I don't want people to beep in this one, but I completely get what you mean. It's that bit, like you say, like a political football. It's that bit where they're singing to mum's ears. I like, oh, free entitlement, and that, I think that word bugs me as well.
Yeah.
Not free. It's free to the parents, and fantastic. That's wonderful. I have no issue with that. What I have the issue with is the poor rate that each
Absolutely.
local authority, from this pot of money that the government deign to give them, that each local authority then gives to settings, it doesn't cover costs. It hasn't
No,
done for years.
and they said that themselves, Glenn. We did that Freedom of Information request a while ago, which they put a figure on it. They being the Department for Education, said that to adequately fund the system, the entitlements would require a rate of £7.49 by 2021. We're not even close to that in 2023. And I calculated the other day, and I said this to the select committee, even if inflation stayed at zero, even if we had no disproportionate rises in the minimum wage, because of course we've got around 9 to 10% at this particular coming up in April, it would take us, with the current investment rates over the spending review that are committed to already, it would take us till about 2040 to catch up with the rate that they said they should be paying us in 2021. Nearly 20 years behind, ignoring the fact that between 2021 and 2023, we've had record inflation into double figures. That's the dishonesty. Full stop.
Definitely. I mean, there's that bit as well. You mentioned about minimum wage going up as well. That's going to be yet another thing that's going to push many more settings under, because where does that come from? It has to go through fees to parents, but
Absolutely.
then parents can't afford childcare. So where do we go? That's the thing.
Well, that's the point. It's, there is a reason why we had record closures in the last 12 months of nearly 5,500. And the one sort of, I suppose, difference between now and maybe 10 years ago is that quite often when you see the reports of early years costs, childcare and education costs being some of the highest in the world, certainly right up there in terms of Europe, it is usually accompanied, when there's a media statement, either in the press or TV, radio, it's usually accompanied by, and yet we have a sector that seems to be on its knees. So at least we're starting to get the recognition that we're not a bunch of greedy providers. There are always going to be those that do very well in any sector. If you take schools, there's always been the private sector and the state sector, and the private sector will appeal to people who want more and smaller classes, whatever it happens to be. So that will never change. But we're talking about the masses here, and most people recognize that we are grossly underfunded. Parents are starting to see that. And so it gives us a little bit more leverage, but it worries me that government talks in terminology such as market collapse. I don't see market collapse. We don't see market collapse. And when you get market collapse, it is nigh on impossible to recover in any short period of time. And I fear that's where we will go for a big chunk of early years, not those operating necessarily in the most affluent areas, but certainly I would suggest that many operating in Middle England and certainly in areas of deprivation.
I mean, you're right. The government talks so much about deprivation and leveling up. That term, leveling up. I mean, it's that bit. If investing in things was done right, would we need leveling up?
No, again, we have, I'm sounding a bit political here, I accept, but we have really moved towards individuals, getting the most that they possibly can rather than thinking about society as a whole. And if we did, we wouldn't be having leveling up agendas. Somebody has to ask the question, why have we got such a high profile program with little action, I would add as well, that's all about leveling up? That's because we have put ourselves by policies into a position whereby, dare I say, the haves have a bit more and the have-nots have a bit less. And that doesn't seem to be what most people want. I think the vast majority, you can't have it when where the bulk of wealth is held with a minority of the population, and that's what we've got. Then you develop policies that start to ignore the well-being of the masses. And by well-being, I mean people that work in early years. Again, I think it was EPI that statistic that shows around 40% of people working in the early years sector claiming benefits or tax credits. Is that how we treat people that educate children's development?
It shouldn't be, but it is.
Yeah, I know.
Before we end our chat, Neil, I'm gonna give you a magic wand, right? So this magic wand can literally create anything. What would you do with it?
Well, the first thing I think I would do is I would pull together those people that live this, and I would have an independent review. There is, if you delve into the DFE website, deep down into their website, there is this graphic which they produced several years ago. And it is a graphic that they're meant to use themselves as almost a checklist for when they're developing policy. And two of the most important items out of those five is one of them is, will it work? So when we were talking about ratios, and we had done research that showed that, people weren't going to change and no money would go back to parents. The answer is government knew before they even put forward the proposals that it wouldn't work. But the most important one, they should ask themselves as a policy former is, who made you the expert? That's what they have on their chart. Who made you the expert? And so I would bring together people that live this in terms of academics, people at grassroots levels that have to do this every single day. And I would have an independent review, because I don't think, that I've ever met a person that would have the system that we've got. And I appreciate you can't change everything overnight, but unless you start, in 20 years' time, we will have the same mess as we've got today. And that sort of does worry me.
Well, Neil, thank you so much for talking to us. And please, whatever you do, keep being vocal, keep being the loudspeaker for the whole sector, because we need people out there that will fight our corner. Neil Leitch, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ken.